Ladies and gentlemen, in a world obsessed with stimulation, where pleasure is often mistaken for fulfillment, we rarely pause to ask, what truly happens when one chooses, or is chosen by, a life without sex? This question is not merely about biology. It is about the soul. About what stirs in the silent corridors of the psyche when one steps back from the dance of flesh. Sexual energy is no trivial thing. It is the pulse of creation, the whisper of the unconscious, the fire beneath human passion. But what if, instead of outward expression, that fire is kept within? It does not die, it transforms. The ancients called it libido, not merely as lust, but as life force. This energy, when untethered from physical release, seeks new forms. It becomes art, vision, madness, divinity. For some, it fuels the ascent of the intellect. For others, it opens the door to mysticism or drags them into the darker realms of the unconscious, where repressed shadows demand attention. To live without sex is not to escape desire. It is to meet it on a deeper level. A silent war begins. Instinct claws at the ego. The mind dreams in symbols. What was once simple becomes layered, archetypal. A man or woman may find themselves speaking with old gods in dreams or writing poetry they do not understand. There is pain in this journey, but pain too is alchemical. In solitude, one enters the crucible of transformation. The outer union once sought with others is mirrored inward. The feminine within the man, the masculine within the woman, these begin to stir. And if one endures the silence long enough, a strange thing happens. They begin to speak to each other. This is the inner marriage, a sacred union, not of body to body, but soul to soul. History whispers of such lives: hermits who saw visions, mystics who touched eternity, artists who burned with longing so fierce they lit the world on fire with their words and images. They did not repress, they transmuted, mystic so. Their abstinence was not retreat, but redirection. And what of the body? It too changes, sometimes with peace, sometimes with tension, but always with presence. The body becomes a vessel not of indulgence, but of awareness. Every breath, every heartbeat echoes louder when desire is not drowned in repetition. And so we see, it is not a matter of better or worse. It is simply a different path, one that asks for courage, for introspection, for a willingness to face the inner wildness, not through indulgence, but through integration. To live without sex is not to become less human. It is, perhaps, to become more conscious of what it truly means to be one. Thank you. Libido, in its deepest sense, is not merely the drive toward sexual union, but the expression of the vital force that animates all human striving. The wellspring of life itself. It is the energy of becoming, not limited to the bedroom or to carnal appetites, but inherent in the artist's brush, the mystic's prayer, the thinker's insight, and the dreamer's vision. In a world hypnotized by physical satisfaction, we forget that this energy, when redirected, becomes a potent catalyst for transformation. The modern individual is taught to interpret libido as a physiological itch to be scratched, a pressure to be released, lest it become pathological. But this view is reductive. Libido, when not expressed through sexual release, does not dissipate. It does not decay. It does not become sterile. Instead, it retreats inward, into the psyche, where it seeks new forms of manifestation. In this inward motion, libido reveals its true alchemical nature. It can transmute desire into creativity, longing into vision, and tension into expansion. When the sexual act is withheld, either by choice, circumstance, or inner calling, the libido does not cease to stir. In fact, it may become louder, more urgent. But this urgency is not simply frustration. It is the raw energy of unrealized potential. Just as a river, when blocked, does not disappear but rather overflows, changes course or carves new paths, so too does unspent libido find new expressions. It seeks symbols, metaphors, images, and pours itself into dreams, thoughts, and compulsions. It becomes the driving force behind creative work, spiritual seeking, and even philosophical inquiry. In the realm of depth psychology, the libido is a bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind. When not channeled outward in sexual expression, it often moves downward, into the unconscious, stirring archetypes, awakening repressed material, and initiating a deeper encounter with the self. The very process of sublimation, the psychological mechanism by which instinctual energy is transformed into socially acceptable or culturally valuable activity, becomes a rite of passage. But sublimation is not repression. It is not denial. It is not prudish avoidance. It is transformation. It is a kind of inner alchemy, where base desire is refined into spiritual gold. Many who have lived without sex for extended periods report an unexpected sharpening of perception. The world, stripped of sexual preoccupation, begins to unveil itself in other dimensions. Colors appear more vivid, music more haunting, ideas more urgent. This is not magic. It is the psyche, now unburdened by constant physical pursuit, reclaiming its energy. Attention, once dispersed, is recollected. The ego becomes more transparent, allowing the individual to glimpse the deeper structures that guide life, symbols, dreams, mythic patterns. But there is a double edge to this inward movement. The same libido that gives birth to creativity can also awaken restlessness, inner conflict, or even obsession, if it is not consciously integrated. The individual may experience periods of inner turmoil, as if being pulled between two worlds, one of instinctual desire and another of spiritual or intellectual yearning. This tension is not a flaw, it is the crucible of growth. The psyche, in confronting its own raw energies, is given the opportunity to evolve, not by denying the body, but by allowing its energies to flow into new and meaningful forms. Thus, when sex is absent, libido does not vanish into nothingness. It does not fade. It migrates into the deep, into the symbolic, into the mysterious core of the self. It becomes the painter's madness, the saint's fire, the philosopher's despair. It becomes longing, not for a body, but for wholeness. Libido, often misunderstood in its modern usage, is far more than a drive toward physical pleasure or sexual release. It is not merely an urge confined to the loins. It is a psychic current, an invisible river flowing beneath every act of creation, longing, destruction, and transcendence. It is the root of desire itself, and it is not extinguished by abstinence. Rather, when one lives without sex, this energy does not die, it migrates, shifts, and metamorphoses. In its truest sense, libido is life force, that which moves us toward connection, beauty, meaning, and even madness. When the body is no longer engaged in fulfilling sexual impulses, this energy must go somewhere. It cannot remain static. Just as steam, when denied an outlet, builds pressure within a closed system, so too does the libido, when denied its usual mode of release, begin to press inward. It turns the gaze from the outer world to the inner terrain, and there, in the depths of the psyche, it begins its quiet, often chaotic work. This is not suppression, it is sublimation, an inner rerouting. The libido, no longer expended in acts of flesh, becomes fuel for other expressions. It pours itself into art, philosophy, solitude, silence, and sometimes even into suffering. But that suffering, if endured consciously, can become a crucible. The same energy that might animate a lover's touch may, in its redirected form, animate a poem, a revelation, a painting, or a transformation of character. This redirection is not a choice so much as a necessity when sexual expression is no longer available. The psyche does not waste fuel, it reuses it. Those who live without sex for long periods often report a strange, at times unsettling, increase in inner activity. Dreams become vivid. Obsessions may arise. Emotional sensitivity heightens. This is not the body rebelling, it is the unconscious stirring. The libido is speaking in another language, symbols, impulses, urges toward growth or creativity, because it is no longer permitted to speak through the body. It is as if denied one voice, it finds another, often more ancient and mysterious. The historical record is filled with individuals who lived lives of sexual abstinence, not from repression, but from an encounter with a deeper calling. Mystics, visionaries, monks, philosophers, many of them lived without sex, not because they rejected life, but because they were overwhelmed by another kind of intimacy, one not with another person, but with the numinous. In them, libido took a vertical path. Rather than moving horizontally toward another body, it rose like smoke from an altar toward something unnameable. And yet, this vertical movement is not reserved only for the saint or the sage. Anyone who ceases to engage in sex, for whatever reason, becomes available to this inner reorientation. In some, the redirected libido produces creativity. In others, melancholy. In some, a kind of ecstatic clarity. In others, an almost unbearable tension. But all of these are signs that the psychic energy is still alive, still potent, still moving. The libido is not gone. It is simply seeking a new shape. It may draw the person towards spiritual literature, music that pierces the soul, or solitary walks that feel more intimate than any conversation. The body may become more sensitive, not less. The mind, once dulled by distraction, may sharpen to a painful degree. Time alone becomes fertile, charged. Even silence acquires texture. Without the rhythmic release of sexual union, the psyche begins to recognize how much of what passes for intimacy in the world is merely escape. Libido, denied its usual expression, begins to ask deeper questions. What is love when divorced from desire? What is power when not exerted over another? What is beauty when not consumed, but contemplated? To live without sex is not merely to abstain from physical union. It is to remove a primary outlet through which much psychic material is habitually discharged. Without this outlet, one is forced to encounter the unfiltered contents of the inner world, much of which is buried beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. This descent inward is not peaceful. It is initiatory, and it often begins with the shadow. The shadow is not evil, nor is it merely the repository of our rejected moral impulses. It is the totality of that which we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, instincts, desires, fears, needs, all that has been exiled from consciousness because it did not fit the image we constructed for survival. Sexuality is deeply entangled with the shadow, not because sex itself is shadowy, but because our relationship to it is often distorted by repression, shame, trauma, fantasy, and unmet longing. When one ceases to engage sexually, the distractions fall away, and what lies beneath is exposed. In this condition, the shadow becomes less of a concept and more of a living presence. The images that rise in dreams are more raw. The projections we cast onto others become more difficult to sustain. Old fantasies, unresolved emotions, and unprocessed wounds begin to emerge with startling clarity. The libido, now turned inward, illuminates the very places we have been taught to avoid. And in this light, we are no longer who we thought we were. The person we imagined ourselves to be begins to unravel. In the absence of sexual release, many experience a confrontation with unmet hunger, not just physical, but emotional and existential. A man may realize he never truly learned how to be alone with his own longing. A woman may feel the full weight of affection she gave away in order to be wanted. The need to be touched, held, seen, these rise to the surface not as complaints, but as truths that have lived in the body for years, unspoken. The shadow holds all of this, not to punish, but to demand honesty. This confrontation can feel like disintegration because the ego, which thrives on consistency and control, begins to lose its footing. The instinctual parts of the psyche, no longer soothed by physical pleasure, start to press against the limits of the persona. Impulses that were once explained away or medicated through sex now cry out to be heard. Envy, anger, possessiveness, fear of abandonment, feelings of unworthiness, even latent aggression. These are not symptoms of dysfunction. They are the language of the shadow, asking to be seen. Yet what is most dangerous is not the presence of the shadow, but its denial. In those who suppress these energies without facing them, the libido may turn against the self. Depression, anxiety, compulsions, or fantasies may intensify. One may begin to act out unconsciously, not in overt behaviors, but in subtle forms of self-sabotage or moral rigidity. The energy that could have been used for integration is instead used for defense, and the psyche becomes split. But the shadow is not simply a collection of flaws or dark tendencies. It also contains untapped strength, the assertiveness we disown to be accepted, the erotic vitality we repressed to appear pure, the authenticity we buried under performance. Living without sex, the veil lifts and much of this begins to re-emerge. The unconscious does not respect the rules of the ego. It demands wholeness, and when denied one pathway, it will forge another. Fantasies may become richer, more symbolic, more archetypal. Attractions may shift, boundaries may blur. The person becomes aware not just of their denied desires, but of the multiplicity of selves within them. When sexual engagement ceases, the silence that follows is not merely physical, it is psychic. The rhythms of interaction, the dance of seduction, the drama of longing and fulfillment, all fall away, leaving a kind of stillness that is rarely encountered in the modern world. This stillness is not immediately peaceful, it is dense, it hums with tension. One might imagine that in the absence of sexual exchange, life would grow quieter. But solitude, when not filled with distraction, becomes a crucible. Without the outward movement of libido, toward the lover, the fantasy, the chase, energy turns inward. This inward turn is not a withdrawal in the passive sense. It is a descent. One begins to hear the internal voices that are normally drowned out by stimulation. The mind, no longer entangled in performance or pursuit, begins to produce strange thoughts. Symbols rise uninvited. Memory becomes unpredictable. The present moment feels unusually naked, as if stripped of its normal defenses. In this space, solitude is no longer neutral. It becomes transformative. The alchemical image of the vessel, the vas hermeticum, offers a meaningful parallel. In ancient alchemical texts, transformation occurs in a sealed container, where matter is isolated and subjected to heat, pressure, and time. Likewise, the individual who lives without sex is enclosed in a psychic container. The absence of relational escape forces the contents of the psyche to ferment. There is nowhere to run. One must sit with the hunger, the restlessness, the boredom, the desire, not as problems to solve, but as elements in a deeper process. This psychic containment generates a kind of internal pressure. At first, it may express itself as unease or even anxiety. The familiar rituals that once soothed, touch, flirtation, erotic fantasy, are no longer present. The mind reaches for distraction but eventually tires. Something begins to shift. The libido, instead of being discharged, builds, and with it comes intensity. What once felt dull or ordinary now becomes charged with meaning. A tree seen through a window stirs a feeling that has no name. A phrase from a forgotten book returns with the weight of a revelation. The world becomes symbolic. True, the solitude that emerges in the absence of sex is not isolation in the common sense. It is a reorientation. Relationships do not vanish, but they lose their erotic charge. Without sexual tension shaping the field of interaction, one begins to see others, and oneself, differently. The gaze softens. The roles that once seemed fixed, seducer, beloved, rival, partner, begin to dissolve. In their place, archetypes emerge: the hermit, the seeker, the wounded child, the androgynous one who carries both anima and animus in potential. Solitude, in this sense, becomes a threshold. It marks the end of one form of relating, the habitual, the instinctive, the performative, and invites the possibility of something more integrated. But to pass through that threshold, one must endure the burning away of old structures. The personality that was shaped through desire begins to crack. One may feel a loss of identity, even a disorientation. Who am I when I am not desired? Who am I when I am not pursuing or being pursued? These are not idle questions. They strike at the root of the ego's scaffolding. As solitude deepens, the inner world becomes populated. The unconscious no longer whispers. It speaks in clear images, dreams, and moods. The soul, once hidden behind persona and projection, begins to show its contours. This is not the soul as a romantic ideal, but as something older, stranger, a being with its own will, its own rhythms. The absence of sexual union externalizes the necessity for inner union. The opposites within, masculine and feminine, active and receptive, eros and logos, begin to stir in their long-forgotten dance. The human being is a tension between nature and culture, between instinct and consciousness, between the animal and the symbolic. Nowhere is this tension more apparent than in sexuality. To live without sex is not to transcend instinct, nor to eliminate it. Rather, it is to be placed directly in its presence, without the familiar rituals of gratification to mediate or distract. In this confrontation, a psychic drama unfolds, a drama between ego and instinct, control and surrender, form and chaos. The ego, as the center of conscious identity, thrives on structure. It defines itself through boundaries, goals, and the illusion of self-mastery. It says, I am this, and I am not that. It must to function. Yet sexual instinct pays no attention to these borders. It speaks a different language, raw, urgent, fluid. It erupts in dreams, fantasies, sudden longings, and irrational moods. It belongs to the deeper layers of the psyche, closer to the body, closer to the earth. When sexual expression is curtailed or consciously withdrawn, the ego can no longer release this pressure through external means. What was once acted out must now be felt. This confrontation is often uncomfortable, sometimes destabilizing. The ego begins to experience itself as inadequate to the task of containing what stirs beneath it. The individual may find themselves obsessing over images, flooded with archetypal material, or drawn toward behaviors that seem out of character. Libido, deprived of its usual pathways, begins to press against the ego's structures, exposing their fragility. one begins to see how much of one's identity was unconsciously shaped in response to instinctual life. How much of one's confidence or social value rested on sexual vitality, desirability, or conquest. It is not the cold discipline of the ascetic who hates the body, but the burning restraint of the one who sees its power and chooses not to wield it. The sexual force is acknowledged as divine, not in theory, but in lived experience. This energy, when held within, begins to shape the inner landscape. The psychic walls throb with it. Solitude becomes charged. Even silence feels alive, as though something invisible is breathing through it. Without the constant looping of desire and satisfaction, the psyche gains access to other forms of knowing. Images rise spontaneously from the unconscious. The mind becomes a temple, but not a quiet one. A place of visions, trials, hauntings. Withdrawal removes the outer noise but amplifies the inner voices. The individual begins to sense their own multiplicity. Parts of the self long buried under identity, role, and sexual persona begin to emerge, not always gently. There may be periods of confusion, even dread, as the ego loses its usual anchors and is confronted with the deeper movements of the soul. But in this space, devotion is born, not to a god, necessarily, nor to a doctrine, but to the mystery itself. The person who lives in sacred withdrawal becomes attuned to subtler currents. The breeze becomes meaningful. The body, no longer acted upon, becomes an oracle. Dreams become scripture. Each moment is an invitation to listen rather than to grasp. In this heightened awareness, one is often visited by inner figures, lovers, demons, ancestors, forgotten selves. They arrive not to tempt, but to reveal. The erotic force, once projected outward, now circulates inward, illuminating chambers that had long been sealed. This condition cannot be faked. Sacred withdrawal is not about external behavior, but internal posture. One may be celibate in practice and still filled with resentment or fear, which is not sacred. Conversely, one may find oneself abstaining not from choice but from life's strange unfolding, and yet discover in that state a spiritual fire more alive than any romance. This fire is eros transformed, the same energy but turned upward, inward, deeper. In the absence of physical union, another form of longing begins to surface, one less tangible but more enduring. When the sexual act is removed from the field of experience, what emerges is not simply deprivation, but the awakening of a deeper hunger, one that no other can satisfy. This is the longing for inner union, the reconciliation of opposites within the self. It is not about replacing external intimacy, but about discovering that the soul itself is divided and that something in us yearns for wholeness far more than for pleasure. Every person carries within them the dual principle, the masculine and the feminine, the active and the receptive, the rational and the intuitive. In ordinary life, these elements often express themselves through projection onto lovers, fantasies, and relationships. We seek in others what we have lost or denied in ourselves. A man may pursue women not merely out of desire, but because his inner feminine, the anima, remains undeveloped, unrecognized. A woman may long for masculine strength not merely in a partner, but because her own animus lives unlived in shadow. When sex is present, the unconscious can remain concealed behind the rituals of romance, seduction, and emotional fusion. But when sex is absent, the projections lose their foothold, the outer screen fades, and the inner drama is exposed. The psyche begins to redirect its attention. The qualities once idealized in others begin to rise from within, often subtly. The man who was always drawn to emotional depth in women may find himself weeping at poetry or dreaming of vast oceans. The woman who longed for assertive strength in men may feel an unfamiliar authority emerging in her voice or her thinking. This is not role reversal, but integration. The soul seeks not polarity, but balance, an alchemical union of its split halves. This process is not linear, nor is it without conflict. The inner opposites resist each other. They mistrust. They argue. They demand sacrifice. The mythic imagination has always understood this. In countless traditions, the sacred marriage, or hieros gomos, symbolizes the union of masculine and feminine within the individual. It is the wedding of sun and moon, sky and earth, spirit and matter. It is not a physical ritual, but an inner transformation. The ego must relinquish its need to dominate. The instinct must cease its demand for gratification. Only then can the soul initiate the encounter between the archetypes that reside within. When this meeting begins, it is marked by intensity, often through dreams, symbols, irrational moods, or creative obsessions. The inner masculine may appear as a guide, a warrior, a critic, or a divine king. The inner feminine may appear as a muse, a mother, a seductress, or a hidden well of sorrow. These images are not to be taken literally. They are the language of the unconscious, the symbols through which integration speaks. To live without sex is to become the stage upon which this drama unfolds. The body becomes the vessel not of physical union, but of psychic reconciliation. Each act of self-reflection becomes a gesture toward that invisible other. Each moment of solitude becomes a dialogue. The inner tension that once reached outward now moves inward toward synthesis. In this process, one discovers a strange kind of intimacy, one that is not dependent on another's presence, but arises from the unfolding of one's own depths. There are moments when the individual feels not alone, but accompanied, as if two ancient figures have begun to speak through one mouth. Identity becomes more fluid, less reactive. One no longer chases love or approval, but begins to embody something both softer and more complete. The union within does not erase longing, but transforms its direction. It becomes less about possession, more about presence. The old roles dissolve, and in their place, something archetypal begins to live through the person, something that was always waiting beneath the surface of ordinary desire.